next webinar from the Dravidian Professional Forum. I, on behalf of DPF as well as our founder, PTR Palnivel Thiagarajan, the Honorable Minister of Finance, thank all of you for joining. And specifically, I would like to thank the speakers, Associate Professor Carole, Tara Krishnamurthy, and Kalpana from IIT Madras, and Priyamata, Consultant Editor to Times of India. Thank you for your time, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for willing to spend some time with DPF and enlighten our viewers. See, today's topic, women in public sphere, has a lot of relevance, and more so it's more relevant for us because probably 2 days before marks the 100-year anniversary of Justice Party's resolution seeking universal suffrage, which includes also for women. So going back to this topic, both in private and political sector, the women representation in India has been abysmally low. So for example, at present, just 11% of the elected senators, both in the upper house and lower house included, are women. And also the significant number within this 11% are wives or relatives of present politicians. According to World Economic Forum, India ranks in 20th from the bottom with regards to women representations in state assemblies as well as in national assemblies. Women reservation bill has been pending in the parliament for last many years. The bill aims to reserve seats for 33% of the seats for women, and Tara Krishnamurthy, one of our panelists, through her NGO Shakti, has been working towards implementing this bill, but still nothing much has happened with regards to this bill. And I also must say, the Honorable MP from DMK, Kanimuli, Madam, she has taken a lot of efforts in passage of this bill. And apart from that, a lot of studies have said the reasons why women representation in parliament is low, or rather in politics is low. They say societal pressure, familial pressure are prime reason, and these are also exacerbated by class, gender, and income. Apart from that, as per an World Bank report, among developing countries, India ranks the lowest with regards to women representation in parliament. And again, Tamil Nadu, it's not a great sign because now we have the lowest representation for women in Tamil Nadu Assembly, lowest in 25 years in the Tamil Nadu Assembly. So I think the situation is not different in private sector. As per the study from OECD, a think tank, female labor participation in India is the lowest in the world, exceptions Arabic countries. And this is again a conundrum because in the last 25 years to 30 years, India has made tremendous progress with regards to education, healthcare, and providing basic facilities for women. So number of percentage of women getting finishing high school or even university education has increased multifold. And also healthcare facilities for women has increased all across India. But unfortunately, when it comes to representation in boardrooms or women in high positions in corporate houses or in political parties, it remains pathetically low. So now I open the floor to a panelist to provide their views on the same. The first to go would be Professor Carole. Yeah, Professor Carole, the floor is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darren. I'm just going to share my screen with my slides.
Yes, please.
Oh, I think I just got a message up, host disabled participant screen sharing. I wonder if you could just change
just a second.
Yeah.
Bharti, can you just enable screen sharing?
Please try now, sir.
Great. Okay, that should be, can you see that? Yeah, great.
Yes, yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I just want to say a huge thank you. It's a huge honour for me to participate in this webinar. I've been working on gender and political representation and policy in India for the last 16 years. And Tamil Nadu was actually my first, and specifically Chennai was the first place I visited in India, and I stayed there for a few months, and Chennai very much took care of me. So I wanted to say that it has a fond memories of that and a fond place in my heart. So thank you ever so much for your very kind invitation to participate today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, let me just click that through. I'm going to talk mostly about the issue of women in Indian politics, and particularly I'm going to focus on descriptive representation. So this is mostly to do with the presence of women in politics as opposed to the representation of women in policy making and in other ways. So, and this, of course, we know that those are interlinked as well, sometimes in quite sort of complex ways, but this is what I'm going to focus on in my talk. And I also want to say, while I'm focusing on gender, we of course know that the intersectional components of gender that interact with other markers of identity are also really important and also manifest in particular ways with regards to women's representation as well. And so I just wanted to kind of sort of say those two things to start off with. So I'm going to try to answer a few questions in this brief presentation. Firstly, what is the status of women in Indian and Tamil Nadu politics? And our host has briefly kind of gone through some of the big headline figures. I'm also going to touch a little bit on the causes of women's underrepresentation in politics. And this is going to be very brief. This is a big field of the international literature and specific literature on gender and politics in India as well. And I'm also going to focus on some of the arguments around why it's important to address women's underrepresentation in politics as well. But then I'm going to focus particularly on what action political parties can take to address this. And I'm very much kind of in awe as well as of the other panelists as well and their work on this in particular. So in terms of key takeaways from my talk, what I hope you will take away from this is that among all of the aspects of women's underrepresentation, the causes, political parties are crucial gatekeepers to women's political participation. Women can and do win elections given the chance. Fewer women will aspire to political office if political spaces are projected as predominantly kind of male domains. And also, crucially, that political parties, a number of political parties in India have committed to passing or to supporting the Women's Reservation Bill. And my suggestion is really that political parties don't need to wait for this bill in order to take action to improve the descriptive underrepresentation of women in parties. Okay, so while that is a policy commitment, that's while that is a laudable policy commitment, there are other things that parties can do while the Women's Reservation Bill is still kind of in limbo. And I think we've already seen some of the things that parties can do. So this is just to re-emphasise that. So what is the status of women in Indian politics and Tamil Nadu politics? So this is a really brief overview. We know that women have been elected in greater proportion to their presence as candidates, right? So the dashed line is their proportion of total candidates, and the bold line is their proportion of, this is in Lok Sabha elections, a proportion of women MPs. Unfortunately, the proportion of women candidates has never exceeded 10%. Partly this is due to the large number of male independent candidates, but as you'll see when we look at parties as well, the proportion of women nominated by parties, particularly major parties, has also often been quite low as well. And the proportion of women elected to Lok Sabha has never exceeded 15%, which of course is much lower than the 33% that the Women's Reservation Bill has argued for in the past. And also, of course, at the local level, we have much larger numbers of women. We've had a woman Prime Minister, we've had a woman President, we've had 2 Lok Sabha speakers as women, we've had a number of Chief Ministers of Indian states be women. So it's really looking at the kind of broader numbers of women in politics, particularly at the parliamentary level and at the state assembly level as well. Now, of course, women's inclusion in the Rajya Sabha, that has remained consistently low as well. So not much beyond the 10% figure. And when we look at legislative assemblies, we can see that essentially women's inclusion as MLAs in India's legislative assemblies tends to be lower than their inclusion as MPs in Parliament. The current figure for Tamil Nadu is here, about 5%, as our host suggested. India's highest ever across India's states has only been 14% of women among elected MLAs, and that includes Tamil Nadu's highest ever, which was 14% in 1991. And to provide a kind of broader policy context and also the scale of the challenge to improve women's representation, Niti Aayog in its SDG targets for the SDG goal 5.5 on gender equality in political participation, they have set the target in state level politics for 50% by 2030. So as we've never had kind of more than 14%, that challenge is huge. And considering elections take place every few years, every 5 years or so, that really does mean only a few elections are available to try to meet that target. So in terms of women in Tamil Nadu politics as well, we have seen that fluctuate. So women's presence among MLA candidates and elected has fluctuated over time, but women's presence among candidates has never exceeded 10% overall. So basically women can't be elected if they're not nominated. So it's really important that parties, particularly major parties, nominate women in order to achieve greater representation as elected candidates. Women are often elected in greater proportion than their presence among candidates. The highest presence of women MLAs was in 1991, as I've already mentioned. And again, party nomination is key in this. Women need to be nominated by major parties to stand a chance of winning. Now, in terms of looking at party nomination, sort of disaggregating across parties rather than just looking at overall figures, we've seen that the DMK and the ADMK have also fluctuated in terms of the presence of women as candidates in any given election. So 1991, we saw the highest proportion of elected MLAs, and this was far above what was actually nominated by parties. But then subsequent to that, party nomination kind of dropped off a cliff in 1996. So it's really important that if we want to see more women in the Tamil Nadu Assembly, then essentially we have to increase the nomination of women. And I just wanted to provide a bit of a comparison with other kind of state level parties as well. Now, this, of course, Trinamool Congress did increase its representation of, this is national parliamentary elections now, rather than the state level elections. So Trinamool Congress increased its candidates of women. I think in the 2021 election, if I'm not wrong, I think it was about 17% in the end, even though the ambition was there to do higher. The BJD, again, in the 2019 parliamentary election, they managed to nominate many women candidates, but the Telugu Desam is kind of more similar to sort of the Tamil Nadu level further down. So this essentially represents parties that have really kind of committed and made an effort to candidate nomination, as opposed to kind of the business as usual. So I wanted to address some of the arguments around why should we address women's political descriptive underrepresentation. And I think there are two sets of reasons here. We can differentiate between intrinsic reasons and instrumental reasons. So justice arguments where basically the motivation is intrinsic. We don't need any other reason to nominate more women or to include women other than justice, that women have a right to participate in the governance of the country of which they're a citizen. Of course, we have another intrinsic reason in believing in gender equality, which is important, again, for a fair and inclusive democracy. And also, this is partly intrinsic and partly instrumental, the legitimacy argument that women's inclusion will actually reflect the quality of democracy more broadly as well. But there's also a number of instrumental reasons, and I haven't included research sources on this, this slide, but there's a huge literature that has debated the reasons, the instrumental reasons, and research that demonstrates these or contests these for women's addressing political descriptive underrepresentation. So some of those reasons include that having more women in politics, there's a potential for women's interests to be better represented in the policymaking process, governance and representative processes. Secondly, that there's a potential symbolic effect on the future inclusion of women. So that can actually lead to, of course, more women coming in or coming forward to enter politics as well, such as the role model effect, but also political socialisation and awareness of rights as well. And then there's the potential impact on other policy goals, whether that's around education, whether that's around employment and other kinds of aspects, or around the family, for example. And also to improve performance on composite goals. So if you have a composite policy goal that actually includes gender equality as part of that, and political participation as part of that, that this can also help to kind of bump up the rankings in composite goals as well. And of course, there's a potential party interest here as well, that women voters may be more inclined to vote for parties that actually make them feel like they're included in the process of, in the democratic process and in the governance process. Whether that's actually in terms of seeing women in governance, or whether that's kind of a symbolic aspect as well. So again, to kind of provide some broader contextualization to this, there are a number of different policy frameworks at different levels. So there's many kind of tools, but also policy sort of ways of framing the action as well, in terms of what you're trying to achieve to address women's descriptive underrepresentation. Of course, this can be very much a local policy framework that draws on the commitments that have been made either in elections or between elections, and in terms of policy, to the empowerment of women and gender equality, and also party-based commitments, and how you link that with the party ethos and those kinds of framing strategies as well, to make that often maybe more acceptable to some people that might be resistant to kind of specific action on this, even if they're broadly on board with the broader goal. In terms of at a national level, of course, you have a Constitution of India, national policy for the empowerment of women, national SDG targets, and a number of other commitments and resolutions as well. And in the international sphere, you can draw on the UN Beijing Platform for Action that relates to women in power and decision making, one of their goals. The SDG goal, as I've already mentioned, ensuring women's full and effective participation. And the IPU Gender Sensitive Parliaments framework, which tries to help political organisations, such as parliaments and legislatures, become a more inclusive space, a more gender inclusive space, so that essentially it makes it more feasible and more kind of welcoming for women to participate in politics. And also international organisation that has a number of advisory kind of resources on gender inclusive political parties as well, which can provide information on trying to do some internal analysis and party mechanisms to improve party inclusiveness. In terms of causes, so I want to go on in a couple of slides time to looking at actually how this links to questions that that parties can ask of themselves as to what things they can do. There are, of course, some things that will be in the party control and the party and the governmental control through policy, but there'll be other things that are broader cultural that require that might require sort of norm change in society as well. And this is true internationally. So I'm drawing here on international literature as well. So whether this is about thinking about the gender inequalities in the resource base for women to participate in politics, especially among lower income women as well. Limited access to network capital and sponsors, for example, for running campaigns, gender discriminatory attitudes around whether politics is really for women. And we can see this through the World Values Survey. They have a specific question on sort of gendered ideas about leadership. Thinking about the double burden with domestic responsibilities, that essentially women have less time because of sort of gender divisions of labour, and that of course fall heavier on women, and also gender norms regarding physical mobility, either during campaigning and other political duties. And lack of family support as well. And this is something my colleague and co-author Shireen Rai has done a lot on in terms of paths to power and the crucial role of the family. And I just wanted to kind of point to this debate that we often have about women in Indian politics, across Asia to some extent as well, about the dynastic route. And I think we also need to be mindful that when women have fewer opportunities to participate, and that having family support, having those political networks that are linked to the family, yes, they provide an advantage, but when they have fewer alternative options, in other words, when they are prevented from participating in politics unless they are connected to a political family. I think then to use this as a way of assessing their efficacy in office, I think can provide a sort of another sort of aspect of discrimination, maybe, that essentially you're limiting the opportunities that they have to participate, and then you're assessing them on the basis of those limited opportunities as well. So I think we need to be a bit careful about that as well. So those are kind of broader socioeconomic, sociocultural, but political, systemic and institutional factors. Of course, we know that proportional representation systems are seen as better than first past the post. This is not something that is necessarily within the control of any particular political party. So we work with what we've got in terms of the first past the post system. But parties being crucial as gatekeepers, whether that's to do with party selection criteria, party culture. So in Japan, we actually, it's a very, very rich country, but we see very low numbers of women in politics. And this, from a number of scholars, including Emma Dalton, has suggested this is partly because of the masculinized party culture and also male-dominated networks of support. Iranaga talks about that in his work. So whether that's male-dominated networks of support, male-dominated feeder professions as well, but also violence and corruption, specifically violence against women in politics, and also movement-based participation that doesn't always translate or transfer into party-based opportunities as well. So there are a number of different kinds of barriers. So in my last slide, I just want to briefly go over some things that parties can do, some suggestions. And as I said at the start, to not kind of wait for the Women's Reservation Bill to take action, and that parties can do this sooner rather than later. And this is really about thinking what are the things that are within the party's control to address. So thinking about who has the most formal and informal influence on who gets selected as a candidate. Is the party selectorate sufficiently diverse? And options to address that could be including more women in the party selectorate, and thinking and mapping sort of who has influence on candidate selection. Is the party's candidate selection criteria unknowingly biased against women as well? So even though while it doesn't set out to exclude women, that actually the kinds of things that it looks for in candidates means that actually women kind of get filtered out of this process. So what kind of experience is preferred for nomination to political office? If party experience is required, how accessible are party positions for women? And are women represented within the party organisation? So there's a number of things that can be done to address this. And I've listed those on the right-hand side. How is winnability? So winnability is often kind of cited as a key sort of determining factor in selecting women candidates. Do attitudes about women's ability to win office, to win elections actually affect assessments of winnability? And that needs to be addressed. And also considering a political party quota on candidates rather than waiting for the sort of reserved seats quota. And it's not just enough to have the quota, but it's also important to enforce it as well. So one of the things that I ask my students to do when I teach them about gender and political representation is to look into the mechanisms for enforcement and compliance with that quota, because often you can have a quota, and in some cases around the world, there's a quota on paper, but it doesn't actually mean very much because it's not implemented, and there's no sanctions for non-compliance as well. Do few women come forward as candidates? And rather kind of than sort of accepting that as is, you can ask why. Why do few women come forward? And then try to address the reasons why. So identify and approach more potential women candidates, actually ask them to run as well. Ask women their perception of the party structure and culture, and also consider training and funding for campaigns as well. And does the party signal its commitment to address violence against women in politics, which we know happens both offline and online as well? And does the party have an internal committee to address sexual harassment, for example? So those are just some things that parties can do internally to try to improve the perception of party inclusiveness and actual sort of inclusion of women within the party, which then could potentially translate into more women candidates to nominate and more women candidates elected and participating in local and state level and national politics, including in Tamil Nadu. So I'll stop there. I hope I haven't gone too far over time. And thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to hearing any questions or comments when we go into the Q&A section towards the end.